10 is actually a little bit of a cop out, and I'm okay with anybody making fun of me for copping out on my number 10. But my number 10 is a tie with Avengers Endgame and Star Wars Episode 9.
Okay. So,
They're significant enough culturally
yeah.
that I couldn't leave them out of my top 10 list, but they're not. Neither one, I think, was. They're both good, but neither one was, I think, especially great.
Well, I thought Endgame was really strong. I thought that Infinity War was stronger.
Uh-huh.
But I did like Endgame. I wasn't wild about the final Star Wars film, and we may end up doing an entire broadcast or entire episode on that.
And I need to rewatch it again to finish reconciling some of the storylines in my mind and things. But it's the end of a 40-year saga. 9 films. It's, and I enjoyed it. I thought it was fun. It was good.
I need to revisit it as well, but I don't anticipate that may refine a few things in my mind, but I don't anticipate my opinion of that film changing significantly.
What was your number 10?
My number 10, and before I get to that, I'm going to just very briefly touch on the 2 other films from 2019 that I've seen since I started this list. Both are good. Both are, I don't know if I could put either in that list. One was Bombshell, which we've already done a broadcast about, which I have some mixed feelings about. It's certainly a thought-provoking film, but I don't know if I'm comfortable putting that in a top 10 list. And then this last weekend I saw Hidden Life, which is the new Terrence Malick film. It's a beautiful-looking film. It's based on the true story of a man named Franz Jagstatter, who was a conscientious objector as an Austrian, who was dragooned into the German army in World War II and simply refused to fight and was executed. It's a beautiful movie. I didn't feel like you really got that into the heads of the characters, which I kind of missed. Though in a way, I see why he would do it that way, because all the people around them were more or less perplexed as to the degree of his intransience on serving with the Nazis, which of course now looks good.
Yeah.
But at the time caused him no end of hassle. I mean, not even including the fact that they killed him for it. But even before that, it would just cause him all sorts of trouble. Those are good films. Those are honorable mentions. But my number 10 is also a film that we've talked about on this broadcast before. It's Richard Jewell.
I have that on my list, but I have that as my number 8.
That's number 8 on the list. Okay.
Yeah.
Again, we've already devoted an episode to Richard Jewell, so there's not a lot else to say about it, other than that it was just kind of refreshing to see a story. I mean, it was a true story from our living memory. And he's a guy that just doesn't, he's the kind of guy who normally wouldn't get a movie. He's this overweight, gun-loving, Southern Baptist wannabe and sometimes police officer. He's just not your average lead for a movie. And the fact that this movie was built around him and he's the hero, I really enjoyed that.
One of the things that's kind of occurred to me since we talked about it, part of the reason I think it resonates with me so well is it also takes us back to a time that essentially was our childhood. It was a pre-9/11.
Yeah.
We grew up in a different world pre-9/11 than a lot of people are growing up in nowadays. And it takes you back into that time, and there's a few things that are a part of that movie that are just reflective of just how different times were pre-9/11.
The 90s, somebody, I want to say it was his first name Francis Fukuyama, who's a economist and like a historian, wrote a number of books, and he wrote a book called The End of History. And I forget if it was him or someone else, called the 1990s, The Holiday from History, which I think fits to a certain extent. I mean, there's just a couple kind of mountains of news in a placid decade, and one of them is certainly the Richard Jewell incident. Yeah. I mean, that kind of shook people out of their complacency for a little bit, and a complacency which we haven't been able to get back since 2001.
Well, number 9 on my list is the Apollo 11 movie, which is a little bit more of a documentary than a film, but it was a film. I'm a space geek, and that film was awesome to go and see. We saw that together.
No, we didn't see it together.
I went and saw it with my sister, but I saw it in IMAX. And seeing that on IMAX, it was so big, and some of the motion scenes, I actually started to get motion sick sitting in the IMAX theater. I've watched it several times since then. It's all stock footage, all stock audio. There is no narration from anyone in contemporaneous or present day. It is all recordings and video shot from the launch of Apollo 11.
Yeah, that's a great film. I saw it largely on your recommendation. I did see it theatrically. I like all sorts of documentary films, but there's something to be said for documentary films that are entirely period audio and visual. There's a film about the Army McCarthy hearings called Point of Order, which is just basically footage of congressional or of Senate committee meetings, and it's absolutely riveting. And it should not be. It's C-SPAN, but cut.
Yeah.
And this film is all stock footage from NASA. It's home movies. It's footage of the crowds. That might have been my favorite part of the film, was just seeing these crowds of late 1960s people in their late 1960s cars, sometimes drinking beers next to their little kids, things that just this sense of the time period.
Yeah.
And the sense of this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. We're packing up the station wagon. We're taking the family down to Cape Canaveral, and we're going to see this bit of history. And there's a scene where they show, it's like a J.C. Penney's parking lot across a section of water from where the rocket's going up. And they must have closed down the store, and every inch of space is full of people and cars, and there's people on the sides of the beach and camping out. And it captured that part of the Apollo 11 that I'd never really seen captured before, and it really resonated with me. But of course, the stuff in space is awesome too, and the stuff directly from NASA. There's a scene where they're showing the control room, and before that, a scene where they have these meetings beforehand with the staff. And I remember seeing that there was 60 men and one woman.
Yeah,
it's make a movie about this one woman that was in the control room. There's just, it made it fresh. And it's a beautiful film. It is number 8 on my list.
Yeah, there's a lot you could go into on how that film was made. In particular, the restoration of the audio tracks, what went into that, because they recorded everything. Everyone that had a headset, everything that was said on that headset was recorded, and those headsets were to connect them with people from their working groups who were in different rooms, because you couldn't fit everyone in the control room, and everything was recorded. But how do you then turn around and preserve that audio? Or how do you restore that audio? Because it was recorded on this large tape that recorded 32 tracks simultaneously. And so they were split up into different tracks, and they were all entirely recorded. In fact, one of the tracks is nothing but media. It was, all the news stations all were in a room where they had access to these headsets, and they could ask NASA public relations people questions over the loop in mission control so that they could go find answers to their questions. And all of that's recorded, and that's why a lot of the even media coverage is on it, because they were able to sync all of these tapes up to the split second to the video that they were recording. But there was a lot of video that was recorded that day and then stuck on a shelf. No one ever watched it until they were getting ready to prepare this movie.
And this video has been very thoroughly scrubbed. It looks great. It does not look... it's obviously from the 1960s, but it's HG quality.
Yeah, it was very well restored. So, what was your number 9?
My number 9 was Jojo Rabbit,
which I have not yet seen.
Jojo Rabbit is a film that I can understand why people would have kind of mixed feelings about it. There's an extent to which I have mixed feelings about it, because there's broad comedy aspects to it, especially early in the film, and it gets more serious as it goes on. The opening sequence has this weird juxtaposition of young Germans and their love for Adolf Hitler with Beatlemania. And that is the aspect that he's trying to explore, is that a lot of these people were just kind of swept up in this excitement, and they weren't necessarily fully processing what was going on or really realizing how bad this was. But it's about a young kid named Jojo. He lives in a village in the country in Germany. His father has disappeared in the war. He's presumed dead. He has a sister that had passed away some years before. It's never made entirely clear how she died. Presumably she got sick and died. And Jojo is very much into the Nazis. He's probably 10 or 11 years old. He's a good kid, but he wants to be like everybody else. And eventually he finds that his mother is hiding a friend of his late sister's who's Jewish in the walls of their house. And how he negotiates this, his loyalty to the Nazis and then his loyalty to his mother. And then the director of the film, whose name I'm not going to say because I would absolutely butcher it, he's a New Zealander. In fact, he's part Maori, and part Jewish. And he plays Adolf Hitler as an imaginary best friend version that Jojo has, who he consults with. He's played as kind of a buffoon. And so people could argue that this film in some ways lessens the evil of the Nazis by kind of making them buffoons. But it also is a way to capture a certain aspect of, that Beatlemania aspect of Nazism, and
Yeah.
the people weren't being rational about this, and they were being swept up. And it's a good film. It's a solid film. It's very unusual. It's certainly a cousin to something like The Producers of The Great Dictator. It's also a film that is distressingly relevant to the current world.
Number 8 on my list, we've already discussed a little bit. My number 8 was Richard Jewell.
Richard Jewell. All right, which brings us to number 7.
8 on your list was...
Eight on my list was Apollo 11.
Yeah. Number 7 on my list, I'm not sure you've seen this yet, Ford versus Ferrari.
I've not seen it.
Yeah, it was good. That's Matt Damon and
Christian Bale.
Christian Bale. It's a kind of a feel-good movie, kind of a buddy movie, but it's a true story, or based on a true story. Well done, well shot. Has some great car sequences in it. Takes us back to, a different time and age. Perhaps you could say a simpler time. Mm-hmm. But Mr. Shelby, who became famous with Ford and some of their racing vehicles, and one of the guys who was a mechanic and driver for him. Mm-hmm. So.
You had compared this to another film that came out a few years ago, the name of which I'm blanking.
I've compared it to Rush. I think it's a more accessible... It has a lot of similarities to Rush, but it's more accessible.
They're both true stories. They're both period car racing films.
Yep. Rush centers around the story of James Hunt and Niki Lauda, whereas this focuses more on Mr. Shelby, I forget his, Carroll Shelby, and then this mechanic and driver of his, and who is portrayed by Christian Bale. And it was a very solid film. It was good. It was fun. I think it's an underrated film from this year. Yeah. It won't win any awards, any of that type of stuff, but it was a very good film.
I've just never really been able to get into racing or racing films.
I think this one would still resonate and be relevant to you. You would like this more than you would like Rush. You would respect Rush for its cinematography. I mean, it was a very well done movie by Ron Howard. It's comparable to some of Ron Howard's best in terms of the cinematography. This is more accessible and more broadly, I'm trying to come up with different words, but it's more broadly accessible and would carry broader appeal, but doesn't have quite as good a cinematography.
All right.
Your number 7?
My number 7 is Toy Story 4.
I've got that ranked a little bit higher, but it's on my list as well.
Where does it rank on your list?
Number 4.
Number 4. All right. Toy Story 4 is a completely unessential movie. After Toy Story 3, which is a freaking powerful film for a kid's CGI talking toy movie, it's like, it just seemed like, okay, we're done. There's nothing more needs to be said. And so when I first heard they were going to do Toy Story 4, I'm like, no, don't force it. But they found a story that worked. They found that they had some new things to say. And I have said that there's the Toy Story trilogy, and this is the epilogue.
Yeah.
It's just this little extra something. Resolves Woody's storyline. It gives him a nice set-off. It kind of sets things up for the future of the group of toys in general. Probably my only complaint about the film is they didn't really have anything for Buzz Lightyear to do, and they kind of came up with this silly little sub-story about his listening to his inner voice, which is his the pre-recorded audio in his little microchip. There's some fun new characters, especially Keanu Reeves, Canadian Daredevil toy.
Yeah.
This bizarre Keanu Reeves has reached this weird place in popular culture where he's basically revered as a spiritual figure.
Yeah.
But he's really fun in it.
Ducky and Bunny
were really fun with Key and Peele. Yeah, it's like you thought that they'd just juiced everything out of this concept that they could possibly have gotten out of it already, and they hadn't.
Yeah.
Which was really fun. Though, all that being said, do not make a Toy Story 5.
Yeah.
At least not for 20 years.
Now, there's one other thing I have to interject on this. Despite liking it, thinking it was a great film, and ranking it number 4 on my list of films for 2019, I still can't stand Forky, and I wish Woody would have left him on the side of the road.
I kind of liked Forky. Forky grew on me.
I mean, he grew on me too, but I still kind of would have liked to have seen him gotten left on the side of the road at the end of the film.
Well, he's got the best little line at the very end of the film, where the little girl creates a spoon girl, and brings the spoon girl home. Was it a spoon or a knife?
I don't remember.
It's another plastic utensil person, and Forky's giving her this pep talk and saying it's like it may be hard now, but there's all these, these wonderful things about being a child's toy, and if you have any questions whatsoever, ask me. I know all the answers. Why am I alive? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, Forky throughout the movie repeats the line, "I'm trash," and I was like, yep. So, number 6 on my list, I put A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
That did not make my list. I liked it. I much preferred the Mr. Rogers documentary from a year or so before.
I did too, but I thought it was still well done. We've kind of had this conversation before. If you were going to have someone portray Mr. Rogers in a film, who could you trust to do it in this day and age?
Billy Bob Thornton.
No.
Oh, okay. No, that would
Tom
that
Hanks
would
is one of the only people that you could come up with who you'd be comfortable with. They did justice to a lot of things. It wasn't directly a Mr. Rogers film, though it centered around Mr. Rogers. I thought it was well done. I enjoyed it. It was good.
So if you're going to make a Mr. Rogers biopic, the worst thing you could do would be to make a Mr. Rogers biopic, to do like a life-spanning thing.
Yeah.
What you want to do is what this film did, which is the story of Mr. Rogers touching a person's life.
Yeah.
And they used this device of the man who wrote a piece on him for Vanity Fair back in the late 90s. They change his name, they fictionalize him, and the story about the estranged father is not true of the actual person, but apparently is true of another individual that Mr. Rogers had helped reconnect with his family, with his father. So you get a kernel of the core of who Mr. Rogers was and what he was able to do, this phenomenal talent he had to connect with children, to bring out the child in other people. Hanks does a very good job. There are moments in which Mr. Rogers here is a little creepy, because honestly, there is an element of Mr. Rogers that is so unusual that it kind of reads as creepy. There's a moment where he's insisting on talking to the reporter through the puppets, and it's like, in another movie, this guy would be a serial killer. But in that same sequence, the reporter tells him something about, well, it must have been hard for your kids to have you as their father. And you can tell in his eyes, you can tell that he's restraining himself, and that Mr. Rogers is not happy with what he's being told, but he's not going to lash out about it. It's like, I think you're right. I think it wouldn't have been easy to have me as a father.
Yeah.
And that's impressive.
Yeah.
And the film really captures something about what made Mr. Rogers great.
Yeah. I can understand some of the criticisms of it, but I thought it overwhelmed that. So, yeah. Your number 6?
My number 6 is Linda Ronstadt, The Sound of My Voice, a documentary about the singer Linda Ronstadt, who, in a really sad irony, has basically lost her voice, her singing voice.
Yeah.
She does this really kind of... It's moving after seeing her whole life of her attempting to sing with some family members at the end. I really am a fan of Linda Ronstadt. She's had a really interesting life. She has had such a big impact on others, and then of course she worked in so many different genres, kind of a folk rock kind of thing to begin with, and then she moved into country. She did some Spanish style music. She did some operetta for a while. She teamed with Dolly Parton and Mary Lou Henner. I'm blanking the name of this other person. They formed a trio, and she actually is indirectly responsible for starting the group The Eagles. So 2 members of what became the group The Eagles were backup musicians for her on tour, and they put them together to room in hotel rooms as they went on tour, and they both started to be like, hey, we should form a group. And if they hadn't met on the tour, there may have been no Eagles. So, and then, of course, she had her romance with Jerry Brown when Jerry Brown was governor the first time back in the 70s and 80s. I just really love her, and her music's great, and it was just really a fun experience to be reminded of her career and just how great she is.
Now, my number 5, I know off the bat that Nate is going to disagree with this one, and I don't think this movie made his top 10 at all. My number 5, I put Captain Marvel.
I would disagree with you, yes.
Yeah. I thought it was a better film, actually, than Avengers Endgame. We actually had a little bit of a conversation about this when we went to breakfast this morning, and before we started recording. There was really nothing for Brie Larson to accomplish in the role of Captain Marvel, which was, I think...
That's my principal criticism.
Yeah. But despite that, I think it was one of the better films in the series. It goes back, gives you a lot more history, accomplishes some setup that was necessary to end the series. But I think films like Captain Marvel are better than these giant conglomerate, like Endgame was. Mm-hmm. As much as I liked Endgame and it made my top 10 list, part of me doesn't like those movies. Yeah. It took me a long time to go and watch the first Avengers movie, just because of that type of stuff. I would go watch the individual ones about the characters, like all the Iron Mans, but I didn't want to go watch Avengers.
Yeah.
So,
I liked the original Avengers movie, and I didn't like Age of Ultron that much, but I liked Avengers, and I liked Infinity War, and I liked Endgame. But I can see what you're talking about, that there's just so much.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's nice to peel it down and just focus on one or two characters, and maybe make the scale not the world's going to blow up each time. I think Brie Larson is a very talented actress, but my big criticism is she's just a blank slate in this movie. I get nothing from her. In fact, to me, this is not her movie. To me, this is Nick Fury's movie. Yeah. It's the Nick Fury movie, and that part of the movie is good. But I got very little out of Brie Larson's Captain Marvel performance, and a lot of people have been very mean to her. Some of these obsessive comic book fans, very misogynistic to her and hating her performance, and I don't want to lump myself in with that at all. I thought it was fine, but I didn't really get much anything from her. She didn't have much of a character.
There's kind of two follow-ups to that. There's going to be more movies starring her, Captain Marvel. That's part of it. The other part of it for me is, and this is kind of a crass way to put this, but it was Brie Larson's turn to just cash a check.
Yeah. Because she puts in some solid stuff, and she can be very selective in what she chooses to do. But yeah, there's the old one for me, one for you formula. It's like, okay, I'll make this big blockbuster, and then I'll make this kind of artsy thing that I want to do. And more power to her if she wants to do that. I mean, these Captain Marvel checks are going to keep her pretty comfortable for some time.
Yep. What was your number 5?
My number 5 was Mike Wallace's Here. It's another documentary. This was not a great year for movies, so I've got 3 documentaries in my top 10 because, and maybe there is a lot that I haven't seen yet, that usually after a year I go and redo my top 10 list to account for the films of one year that I didn't get to see until the next year. But Mike Wallace's Here is also done entirely with period footage. And now some of that period footage is Mike Wallace being interviewed directly, because obviously he had this huge career. He's Jewish. He was born in Massachusetts in the late 19-teens. He worked in radio, and then he got into television, and he was kind of a jack of all trades. He was doing commercials. He even acted. He played a detective on a show in the late 40s for about a year. And then he ended up being put into news. And I want to say Walter Cronkite and definitely Hugh Downs also started out in kind of the game show, like Mike Wallace hosted game shows. And there's like, okay, you're pretty good at talking to the camera. Let's move you over to the news division. And it took off for him. And then, of course, 60 Minutes. He was at the point where he was considering an offer from the Nixon campaign to come and work for the campaign as a spokesperson. And then Fred Friendly, who had been his producer for a long time there and a good friend at CBS, said, I'm doing this thing called 60 Minutes, and I think you'd be perfect for it. It'll be an opportunity for you to get back into the log form interviews, which he used to do on a show called The Mike Wallace Interviews in the late 50s, which got canceled because they got sued by one of their guests. So it's like, yeah, we don't like these probing interviews so much. And then that became his career, is these probing interviews. And then they talk about his personal life. He was married many times. He had a child that died in his 20s under kind of mysterious circumstances. There's a lot of tragedy in Mike Wallace's life, but it was amazing what he did. And he did 60 Minutes for around 40 years. And he was just consistently a great reporter and a great interviewer. And in this time period that we're in now, where the media is getting short shift by a lot of circles, it's neat to be able to have someone like Mike Wallace that can really be held up as a man of great journalistic integrity and super talented, super good at what he did.
My number 4 we've already discussed, Toy Story 4. What was your number 4?
My number 4 was Booksmart.
Which I haven't seen.
This is Olivia Wilde's directorial debut. She is not in it, but her husband is as principal. It's about these 2 book-smart kids that are in student government. It's the end of their senior year. They've been the type that kind of eschewed popularity and the social scene because they were going to concentrate on getting into really good schools. They got into really good schools only to find out at the last minute that most of their friends also got into really good schools, even though they goofed off and they had fun in high school, because this is an upper class high school somewhere in California. So they're rich kids. So they decide that just the night before graduation, they are going to try to make up for 4 years of being social pariahs and go to as many parties as they can. And it's in the tradition of something like Superbad. In fact, the lead actress is the sister of Jonah Hill. I'm blanking her name right now. She's very good, as is the girl that plays her friend, who is the younger daughter of Tim Allen's character on, what's Tim Allen's current sitcom?
Oh,
the one where he plays the sports store.
Yeah, I'm blanking on the name, even though I've been watching it. I can't remember.
But she's in it. She's real good.
Yeah.
They've got a good cast of young people. And this is a film, and I understand it's a fictional film. I understand that it's a comedy. But it made me feel good about this post-millennial generation. It's like, okay, these guys, they're going to be okay if this is any indication of what they are like. Because we often hear a bunch of crap about them, about how they're super sensitive and these other criticisms. But there's a flip side to that. They generally don't want to hurt other people, by and large, and that's admirable. And I just really enjoyed it. I enjoy these films that are about a generation. I really love Fast Times at Ridgemont High, which is about Generation X high schoolers. There's a number of films, I guess, about our generation high schoolers. Blanking some names right now on some of those. But this film just really kind of captured a sense of this rising generation. It's smart, it's funny, made you feel good.
Cool. Now, my number 3, I think, is probably the sneaker and the surprise of my list, and I think will come as a big surprise to Nate, and I know Nate has not yet seen this movie. Number 3, I went ahead and put Knives Out.
Knives Out.
Now, I was a little bit torn. I knew it belonged in my top 10. I wasn't sure where to put it. It ended up at my number 3. That may change over time. Knives Out is kind of a surprise film of the year. It was fun. The first 30 minutes of it, I'm not sure it will hold up that well. I'm not sure the first 30 minutes are that good. The first 30 minutes, you're kind of trying to figure out what this film is. And I'm not sure that the first 30 minutes of this film knows what this film is yet either. But it comes around and it ends really solidly. Good cast. They all work well together. Yeah, great performances. Well, nothing that will, again, be award-winning performances, but solid performances across the board. Twists that you didn't necessarily see coming through most of the movie, and yeah, it was a good suspenseful thriller of a film.
My number 3, I did see theatrically, even though it is a Netflix production, is The Two Popes.
Yes.
The Two Popes is based on a play called The Pope, written by a New Zealander. It is directed by a Brazilian, Fernando Meirelles. I may be getting his name wrong. He did The Constant Gardener, and he did The City of God, which was, I think that was a Best Foreign Film winner back in like 2001, 2002. But this is a great film. It's a type of film that I wish there were more of. It's two serious people talking about serious things seriously, and it's riveting. And it's mostly just two people conversing. This is about Pope Benedict the 16th, Cardinal Ratzinger, Joseph Ratzinger, here played by Anthony Hopkins, and Jonathan Pierce playing Pope Francis, whose real name was Jorge Mario Bergoglio. Horrible with foreign names. But it's great. I thought going into it that it would mostly be, Benedict is the conservative and Francis is the liberal, and they'll kind of do this back and forth under pretty predictable lines. And there is an element of that in the film, but it's also about how they come to really respect each other more. They always kind of respected each other, but how they come to connect with each other and kind of understand each other more.
Yeah.
And then there's a good portion of this which is flashbacks about Pope Francis's earlier life in Argentina. I knew some of this story, but it's really fascinating, some of the things that led him up to where he became Pope. It was not a straightforward trajectory with him.
Yeah.
It's really worth hearing this story. And I came away with greater respect for both men after finishing this film than I had going in with. It's about how we can bridge our differences and respect each other,
which is relevant.
Which is really relevant.
Yeah. I need to revisit this film. I tried watching it, but it was at a time when I was physically exhausted, and I fell asleep partway through and missed a chunk of it. So my number 2 was The Joker.
The Joker, really?
Yeah.
All right, go on. We've done an entire episode on The Joker, but why is The Joker worthy of the number 2 slot?
I just thought it was so well executed and it resonated with me on a certain level, and just I thought it was good. I think it was one of the stronger entries of the year. It is extremely dark, but I think it's still one of the better films made this year.
As we discussed in the episode that we recorded on The Joker, what I couldn't get, and I think this is a really solid film, but the reason it's not on my list is I could not get past the fact that it just felt like it was recycling better material.
Yeah.
And even though in and of itself it's really good, and in and of itself it is one of the better films of the year, I think it also speaks to a sad trajectory in mainstream American films, that you slap a comic book character on the recycled plots of 2 Scorsese classics and you get one of the best films of the year. That should not be.
Yeah.
Again, I liked it, but I can't put it on my top 10.
Well, and I have openly admitted that I haven't seen the ones that you referenced that are, you say it's better. There are better versions of this film. So I don't have that to compare that with, but once I see them, maybe it will fall in my esteem. But for the time being, yeah, that's my number 2.
All right. My number 2 is Little Women, which is the Greta Gerwig version of the story. I understand she takes some liberties with the plot. I don't think the original novel, which of course I have not read, really goes much, if at all, into the adulthoods or the young adulthoods of some of the Little Women, but this film does. It moves back and forth between 2 storylines. One with the March children, the 4 young girls in the Civil War era. They live in Connecticut with their mother. Their father is off fighting in the war and is pretty well absent from most of the proceedings. And then you juxtapose that with plot lines going on probably around 1870, 1871, and you go back and forth. It threw me a little bit at first. It's okay, what timeline are we in now? But you can generally figure it out based on context clues, also haircuts, things like that, determine which storyline, because it doesn't put the date up on the bottom of the screen or anything like that, which is fine. I mean, it worked. It just took a little bit for me to catch on to it. But I've never seen a version of Little Women before. I knew basically nothing about this story other than it's 4 March sisters, Connecticut, the Civil War, their dad's off serving, and the trials and tribulations of growing up. It's great. I cried in this movie, which is kind of sad. And when I say I cried, I wasn't bawling, but tears ran down my cheek no less than 4 times in this movie.
Yeah.
It's very moving. It's beautiful. It's positive. I've mentioned before that you can get a lot of really solid stuff that's kind of dark or depressing or serious, and you can get a lot of stuff that's made that is happy or optimistic, but it's difficult to get one that's both positive like this and smart like this. And the only other person I can think of off the top of my head who can consistently produce such material is Aaron Sorkin. But I just felt really good and moved and happy. This movie made me happy. Yeah, it's number 2 on my list.
I haven't seen that one yet. It's one I need to catch up on. But number 1, I'm kind of curious if our number 1s will match up this year.
I suspect they will.
So you want to go ahead and make a guess what my number 1 is?
No, go ahead and tell me.
My number 1 is Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
As is my number 1. I watched this film, and then within about a week, I'm like, you got to go. I'm gonna drag you to the theater, and you're gonna watch this movie. You're not a big Tarantino guy. I am a Tarantino guy. Both of us have some exceptions. Neither of us really cared for the Kill Bill movies, and I really kind of disliked The Hateful Eight. I think that was
I haven't seen that
the
one
only
yet
film of his that I'm like, ugh.
Yeah, I haven't seen that one because of the negative reactions to it. Yeah, and Quentin Tarantino to me seems a little too over the top and a little inconsistent. This film was really good.
This film is joyous. It is a film that's in no hurry to get where it's going. It soaks in the atmosphere of late 1960s Hollywood. You feel like you can stand up and stretch and walk around in it. Everything, the movies on marquees, the magazines, the products in people's homes, they're all period specific, period accurate. This film was inspired by Tarantino's Boyhood, much of which was spent in Los Angeles. And he said one of the big memories he has of his childhood is his father driving him around Los Angeles. And so there's a lot of scenes of people just driving around Los Angeles, going to interviews and going to jobs. The film centers on Leonardo DiCaprio, who is a kind of a has-been actor who starred on an NBC series, Western series called Bounty Law. This is a fictional series they created for the film, where he played a bounty hunter. And then after that series wrapped, he made a couple kind of cheap movies and then has mostly been sustaining himself through guest shots on other television shows, and they list some of them. The FBI, Land of the Giants. And he has continued to employ his old stuntman, played by
Brad Pitt. Character's name is Cliff Booth.
And he's basically become his personal assistant, and he's also his best friend. And so you've got this storyline of Leonardo DiCaprio, and what's his character's name again?
Rick Dalton.
Rick Dalton. So Rick Dalton's been offered to go to Italy to make some spaghetti westerns. He has mixed feelings about this. He's filming an episode of the series Lancer. And then you have this other plot going on about Sharon Tate, who is played by Margot Robbie. And of course, we all know what happened to Sharon Tate. And so you have this juxtaposition of Rick Dalton and his stunt man trying to keep his career alive, and then Sharon Tate going about her daily activities. And you know where this is going, and you know what it's building towards, but it's not in a hurry to get there. And when it gets there, it takes a different form, because this is once upon a time in Hollywood. This is a fairy tale version of 1960s Hollywood. And I absolutely adored this movie. I saw it twice theatrically. I was going to see it a third time theatrically, but that didn't work out. But yeah, highly, highly recommend this movie.
Yeah. The only thing that I thought was over the top in this one was kind of towards the end, that one moment in the house with Brad Pitt. It works very well within this film. Uh-huh. It takes on that Tarantino violent moment. It's much more abrupt, and brief in this film than it is
and then a lot of the other films, especially something like Django Unchained, where they have a similar sequence that goes on, just keeps going on. Watching this film reminded me of watching a film of Tarantino's that came out 10 years before, Inglourious Basterds. And my sister really wanted to see that film, and I took her to see it in the theater, and this was the first time she'd seen a Tarantino film, and I kept kind of glancing over at her face to see what is she making of this. And as it progressed, it went from kind of confusion to like, oh, okay, I'm getting this. I'm getting the rhythm. I'm enjoying this. And throughout that film, it's building to something, and at a certain point in watching it, I'm like, oh my goodness, is he going to change history? Are they going to kill Hitler? And what's great about this film is, I don't think we're spoiling much to say that history does not end the way it actually did in this film. But I didn't pick up on that. I was so into the storylines that I just was totally taken by surprise when they did it again.
Yeah.
And it's great. I mean, this is such a distinctly Tarantino film. I mean, who else can make a film like this? I loved it.
A couple of honorable mentions for me: Ad Astra, Bombshell, and Just Mercy were some honorable mentions. Ad Astra, I think maybe tried a little too hard. That's another Brad Pitt movie. It was a good film. It has some great imagery.
It was trying to do Interstellar, wasn't it, in some ways?
Kind of. In some ways, I think it's a better version of Interstellar. I thought the first 3/4 of Interstellar was really, really, really good. The last quarter lost me. Ad Astra, it uses some NASA footage, so there's some great, great imagery in this film, but just doesn't quite land with the storyline. So they tried a little too hard. Bombshell we've talked about, and Just Mercy I just saw. It's a good film. I have a feeling the book will be exponentially better. It's on my list to read. Just doesn't quite land. It probably might land better within different communities. I listen to a lot of podcasts about this type of subject of wrongful convictions, things like that. A lot of true crime podcasts. It fits within the narrative of a lot of those podcasts. It just doesn't quite land. Isn't good enough to make a top 10 list, but it's a good film.
Yeah. I think most of my honorable mentions have been either the two that I talked about before I talked about my number 10, and then some of the ones that we've talked about on this list, like The Joker, that I think were some of the more solid films of this year. Again, so far this 2019 was not a great film year. I've still got a lot that I need to see, and probably Knives Out. I from what I'm hearing, is probably the kind of film that will probably make a later version of my top 10 list, but I have yet to see it.
Yeah. And then while I was compiling this list, I wrote down two that I think were my two worst of 2019. One of them, I think, I know Nate and I will be in agreement on. The other one, I'm not sure a lot of other people will agree with me, and it's not a terrible film. It's just not a great film. Kids probably love this film, things like that. It's a good kids film. I suspect I would turn it on for kids if I was babysitting. Not a movie for adults, and that is Wonder Park.
Wonder Park.
But the worst film of 2019, in my opinion, was Godzilla, King of the Monsters.
Okay. Absolutely agree with you. Very quickly touching on Wonder Park, though. That's a film you saw because you saw it with like a niece or nephew, right?
I went and saw it with some friends and their kids. Their kids are like nieces and nephews to us. But the guys went and saw one movie and the girls went and saw another, and so we went and saw Wonder Park. There just wasn't much else in the theater.
CGI animated
Yeah.
children's film. It's not bad. It's just not a.
Just doesn't land.
Yeah.
Like I said,
It's not for you.
the child I saw it with enjoyed it. I think he was the only one in our group who did.
Godzilla King of the Monsters is one of two films this year that I seriously considered leaving the theater while watching. The other was Midsommar, which is a good film, but which is just intense and often unpleasant, but really well made and smart. Whereas that cannot be said of Godzilla King of the Monsters.
Well, there were
certain parts of it were well made.
There was parts of it I
looks
wanted.
good.
I wanted to like it. I've kind of come around more recently to some of these kaiju films. Pacific Rim, I think, was surprisingly good. Kind of a little over the top. Some of the other Godzilla films, I really enjoyed those. So I wanted to like this film, and there are a couple sequences in this film that I thought were really good. The parts of this film that were bad were so bad that it overwhelms the good parts.
I thought it was absolutely ridiculous and over the top, and at the same time boring as heck and repetitive, and I didn't care about anybody in it. It just misfired on every level. And I liked the Godzilla film from 2014, though I felt that one lost its soul when it killed off Bryan Cranston. And I am curious to see the upcoming Kong vs. Godzilla. I liked the King Kong film that came out a couple years ago that also had Brie Larson in it, and Tom Hiddleston and Samuel L. Jackson. But yeah, Godzilla King of the Monsters was awful. It was the worst film of the year that I saw.
Yep. Well, we will now kind of transition into Best of the Decade. This one will be largely Nate because I haven't kept lists in the way that Nate has. I'll interject on some of them. Just throwing out a few of my Best of the Decades, though. Just throwing out some titles, not in any particular order. Just some films I really enjoyed from the last decade. All Is Lost, which I think might be a surprise to Nate.
Was that... Who was in that one? Refresh me. Robert Redford?
Yeah, Robert Redford. It's Robert Redford by himself the entire film. He says one word the entire movie.
Really? If you can anchor a film with just one person, that's amazing. Very few people can do it. Tom Hanks can do it. He did it in Castaway. Spencer Tracy can do it. He did it in Old Man in the Sea. I totally believe that Robert Redford could do it, but I have not seen it yet.
It's one you should add to your list and you should see. I think you'd like it. It was from 2013. Ant-Man and the Wasp, I think, was one of the better Marvel movies of the past decade. As I mentioned previously, Apollo 11. Argo, I think, was one of the better films of the decade. Good. Nate will disagree with me on this one, but I really enjoyed Arrival. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Lincoln, Call Me By Your Name.
Yeah.
And First Reformed.
Call Me By Your Name made your top highlights of the decade.
It was one that, as I was compiling a list from the decade, was on the list. If nothing else, it's an honorable mention. And First Reformed, that was a very solid film.
Yeah, First Reformed. So I'm going to work my way up. I blog, and a number of years ago, I went back through. I would just search the year, and this is how I do it each year when I make up my top 10 list. I just search the year, and then I look through my reviews, and it reminds me of what I liked, and then I put them in an order. So I have top 10 lists actually going back to 2006. So I'm not going to do 2006 through 2009, and I'm not going to do the entirety of these top 10 lists, but I'm going to talk about my top 3 for each year from 2010 up to present. We've already talked about my choices for 2019. Some of these lists were made years ago, and so if I were to remake them today, they may come out differently. But what I put for my 2010 list of best films And I compiled this list back in 2016, and then after 2016, I started doing them yearly. But my top 3 of 2010 was number 3, Another Year. This is a British film that follows the life of an elderly, probably in their early 60s, late 60s, maybe even 70. They're in their 60s. British couple and their son and some of their friends over the course of about a year. It's done in 4 acts. Each act is given a season as a title, and it's just a day from that season. Beautiful film. I highly recommend it. Nobody whose name is going to jump out on you in this cast, but it's just very solid. I like films that are not typical. Like, you don't get a lot of films like everyday kind of things in this. Especially women over 50 get short shift in films.
Yeah.
So this film has, I think, at least 2 women over 50 in the film, one of which is given an awful lot to do. So I highly recommend Another Year. Number 2 for 2010, Inception. Very creative film, great cast, wonderful visuals. It's smart. It is gimmicky, but it works.
Yeah.
Number 1, I think you would agree with me, my favorite film of 2010, I think was also your favorite film of 2010. It is the Oscar winner for Best Film 2010. It is The King's Speech.
Oh, I love that film. I didn't realize that was from 2010.
I didn't think that I would like this nearly as much as I did when I ended up seeing it. Because I thought, oh, this is kind of trite and very conventional. But he's just great. Blanking the name.
Are you talking Jeffrey Rush or Colin Firth?
Both.
Yeah.
But especially Colin Firth. Colin Firth's a super likable guy. And then you had discussed the lady that plays his wife, who plays the queen.
Helena Bonham Carter.
Helena Bonham Carter. And I remember you talking to me about it, and you weren't familiar with Helena Bonham Carter at the point that you first saw this film.
Outside of like the Harry Potter
Yeah,
films,
but you said she just has a real presence, and she does.
Yeah.
She's got a very distinct look to her, and she's good in it. This is a feel-good film. How much the king's being able to give a decent speech really affected the nation's morale in the war effort is probably exaggerated, but you feel good at the end of this movie.
Yeah.
My top 3 from 2011. Number 3 is Super 8, J.J. Abrams film. I think probably my favorite J.J. Abrams film, which is a spoof on the monster movie. It's a spoof on the Spielbergian children's movies of the 80s, even though this is set in 1979. It's about a group of children in a coal town, I want to say in Ohio, that encounter an extraterrestrial presence while they are attempting to make a Super 8, which is an old format for old film format, trying to make a zombie movie for a local film competition. And they stumble upon this extraterrestrial, and it's just joyous. It just really captures what those Spielberg films, or the films that imitate Spielberg films like The Explorers, captures that ethos. Number 2, Terrence Malick film Tree of Life. Have you seen this?
I haven't.
Absolutely beautiful film. Unusual film. The first 30 or so minutes of this are dinosaurs and the start of life on Earth. And then there are sequences later on that I think are in the afterlife. But the bulk of the film is about a young kid's childhood in small-town Texas in the early 50s. His father's played by Brad Pitt. His mother is played by Jessica Chastain. This is kind of just as Jessica Chastain is starting to kind of emerge on the scene as a big star. Just heartbreaking, sad. I mean, that the father's an angry man, and the mother just tries so hard, and then he's got his siblings, and it's just absolutely beautiful. And it's a film of moments. You could argue that not a lot happens story-wise in it, even though the entirety of like the universe kind of happens in the course of this film. Terrence Malick's visuals are just astounding. I highly recommend this film. My number 1 film of 2011 is The Descendants. This is an Alexander Payne film. It stars George Clooney. It's also got, what's her name, from the Shailene Woodley in it as his daughter. And George Clooney is a member of a very prominent white Hawaiian family, the King's Hawaiian Rolls.
Yeah.
And he is a lawyer, and his wife is injured very severely, ultimately fatally, in a water skiing accident. And she is on life support, and she's going to die. And after this happens, George Clooney realizes that his wife was cheating on him.
Oh.
And he's got to tell the guy. It's like he feels an obligation to tell the guy that she was having an affair with what happened to her. And he's also having to deal with a decision about whether the family's going to sell some land to a resort that's been in the family for generations. And he's basically there's some legal means by which this was arrived at, but he's basically the trustee and trust of the family. So ultimately, he makes the decision, but he's supposed to have a family vote. It's a beautiful film. I love Alexander Payne films. I love this movie. You should see it. I'm sure we could talk about it at length. So that's my favorite film of 2011.
I think my favorite of 2011, I'm not sure you've seen even yet, was Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close.
I've not seen it.
Yeah.
The one trivia thing that I recall about Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close is it is the film so far with the lowest Rotten Tomatoes score to still receive a Best Picture nomination. I want to say it was in the high 50s, low 60s.
You should see it sometime so that we can discuss it, even if it's not for the podcast. You should check it out and so we can discuss it. Max von Sydow had a tremendous performance in this film.
I saw recently, I watched a documentary on Max von Sydow, and they talked about this performance. He doesn't say a word. Mm-hmm. He's mute.
Yeah.
And they say, it's still an amazing performance. He's acting entirely with his face and with his eyes, because he is amazing.
Yeah, he is.
Best films of the year 2012. My number 3 was The Master. This is a Paul Thomas Anderson film. It's a slightly veiled retelling of the origins of Scientology. Philip Seymour Hoffman plays basically a con man who is starting a Dianetics-type movement. Amy Adams plays his wife. Joaquin Phoenix is a man, I want to say he's a Navy veteran from World War II. This film is set in the early 50s. He's just kind of lost in life, and he ends up being brought into the inner circle of the master and becomes very loyal to him, dangerously so. Very good film. Do not attempt to watch it with your mother, because I started to watch this movie with my mother very quickly. I'm just going to watch this movie by myself.
Yeah.
Number 2, you probably agree with me, it's maybe your favorite film of 2012, Zero Dark 30.
That is certainly one of my favorite of the year. That was 2000. This was a good year.
2012
was a very
year.
strong year.
Catherine Bigelow directed. She had the first woman to win a Best Directing Oscar a couple years earlier for another war on terror-themed film, The Hurt Locker. This film also stars Jessica Chastain as the woman who kind of put together the clues to determine Osama bin Laden's location, which allowed SEAL Team 6 to go in and dispatch him.
Yeah. I remember I kind of followed this at the time. I read a number of the books that have come out about this. This film, from what we've been able to gather from publicly available information, is one of the most accurate portrayals of the film.
Even though we still don't know who this woman is, right? Not by name?
We might.
We might.
There are people who have tried to out her. Her identity is officially being kept undisclosed for obvious reasons. But yeah, there's things out there if you wanted to piece it together that you could come up with a pretty solid idea of who it is.
Here's a tangent for you. We both seen and we both quite like the movie All the President's Men.
Mm-hmm.
So All the President's Men came out in 1976. It's about events from 1972-73. And in the film, even though he's shown almost entirely in shadow, is Hal Holbrook playing Deep Throat. Hal Holbrook looks like W. Mark Felt, the actual Deep Throat.
Yeah.
He looks enough alike him that had they known, he still would have been appropriate casting. So one wonders what how much Jessica Chastain looks like the actual woman she's playing.
From what I understand, she doesn't.
She doesn't. Well, yeah, it's Jessica Chastain. Who looks like Jessica Chastain?
But,
other than Amy Adams.
But Catherine Bigelow did a great job of weaving in political things that were occurring at the time. I have for a long time said that Obama, when he was president, I said that his legacy was that he will have been known as the squanderer in chief. And there are things interwoven into this that a number of years from now may not be seen with the political context that it was at the time that it was released, but it also illustrated that in context at the time that it came out. Catherine Bigelow did a very good job of weaving multiple storylines together in this film. So, yeah.
My number 1 film for the year 2012 is Silver Linings Playbook.
Really?
I love this movie.
That quite surprises me.
It's a joyous movie.
Yeah.
It takes you from the low of the lows to the high of the highs. It's got wonderful supporting characters. Robert De Niro as the father. Of course, Jennifer Lawrence won the Oscar for it. You got Bradley Cooper's in it. family in Pennsylvania. He's got problems. He was committed because of things having to do with his wife leaving him. He's obsessed with his ex. Another troubled soul, played by Jennifer Lawrence, who lost her spouse. Her husband died, is attempting to find something to focus on, and she comes up with ballroom dancing. She wants to enter a ballroom dancing competition and ends up, through circumstances, more or less forcing Bradley Cooper to be her partner against his will. Because she's kind of extorting him in a weird way, and it's just beautiful. I love this movie.
It is a good movie. I didn't think it was the best of the year. Now I want you to read the book so we can compare notes. Cause
you'd had this discussion about you thought the book was just so much better.
It was better, but the book also has this ability to make you feel as though you're experiencing someone else's mental illness.
Yeah.
Where that did not translate into the film.
So one, a little bit tangent-like, but I felt somewhat similar when I read in high school To Kill a Mockingbird, which I absolutely loved. And then we watched the movie afterwards. And having just read the book, the movie was kind of eh. But the movie's amazing.
Yeah.
But you have to have a certain distance from the source material, I think, to really appreciate how good the movie is.
Yeah. This was a really good year. I mean, we're skipping over Life of Pi, Les Mis, Argo, which I previously already mentioned. This was just a very good year for film.
No, 2012 was very strong. Just very briefly, other 2012 films that had made my list include Moonrise Kingdom, Argo, The Dark Knight Rises, The Place Beyond the Pines, and Lincoln. 2013, kind of a weak year. My top 3 is American Hustle, number 3. That's kind of a follow-up in terms of cast to Silver Linings Playbook. It's based on a true story of a scam and the investigation of a scam involving some congressmen and other politicians in New Jersey in the 70s and Arab investors. It's a really fun film. Also has Amy Adams, Jennifer Lawrence, Christian Bale.
I still haven't seen this film.
Bradley Cooper, Jeremy Renner. It's a really good cast. That's a good film. Number 2 for that year is 12 Years a Slave, which I need to rewatch again, because thinking back on it, I hardly remember anything about it.
I actually haven't caught up with this one yet.
I remember it being very powerful. It's based on the true story of a man who was a free black man from the North. He was a musician. He traveled down south for a gig. He was kidnapped. They misrepresented who he was. They said he was a runaway slave. I ended up being a slave, and he was a slave for a dozen years before finally escaping back to his family, and he went through hell. This film is by the British director Steve McQueen. My number 1 film for the year 2013 is Nebraska, another Alexander Payne film. It's shot in black and white. It has Bruce Dern in it.
Bruce Dern, Will Forte.
Will Forte. Okay, so this is it's another Alexander Payne film. It's done in black and white. It has Will Forte. It has Bruce Dern. Bruce Dern's great, and I love Will Forte in this. It's such unconventional casting because he's a Saturday Night Live guy, and I didn't know he had this in him. And it's an underplayed part, but I think the casting against type with a comic actor in this part really helped it. And Will Forte is a man. He lives in Montana in some small to mid-sized town. His brother works for a local television station in the news department. He's just beginning to do occasional on-air stuff, but he mostly works behind the scene. And his father keeps trying to run away on foot, and they keep having to get him and bring him back. And what has happened is he had received a mailer saying that he had won some prize, but it's obviously just an advertising thing. He's an old man. He's misinterpreting it. He thinks he's won this big prize. He will not be dissuaded that he has not, but he has to go to Nebraska to pick it up. So Will Forte eventually agrees, I'll take my dad. And Will Forte is not very successful. He's a salesman at a consumer electronics store like a Best Buy, and he recently broke up with his girlfriend. And so he takes his dad on a trip to Nebraska to pick up this supposed prize in Omaha. And most Alexander Payne's films have an element in Nebraska because that's where he grew up. And they stop by at this little town, and these depressing little towns, wherever they are in the country, that you could see there once was something going on, but now it's just full of old people, and it's poor and it's kind of sad. And this is the town where Will Forte was a little kid. That's where he was born and where his dad grew up. And they go to stop and visit some extended family there. And they visit some family graves, and they visit the house where his dad grew up, and they tell this story about how his dad, when he was a little kid, shared a room with his brother, and his brother got sick and died and was in the same bed with him when he was dead. And it's just, and he finds out things about his father's service in the Korean War that he never knew, and possibly about an affair, and just these things about his dad that he simply did not know. And it is just beautiful and moving and understated and funny. And I love this film. You need to see Nebraska.
You skipped over two of my favorites from that year, Gravity and Captain Phillips.
Captain Phillips we watched. Captain Phillips is solid. Apparently the Tom Hanks version of Captain Phillips was probably a nicer guy than the actual Captain Phillips.
Yeah.
That's a very solid film. I remember it's based on the true story of the Somali pirates, early 2009. I remember when this happened because I'm like, Barack Obama just become president, and the first foreign policy crisis of his administration could have been the first foreign policy crisis of Thomas Jefferson's administration.
The
pirates off the coast of Africa.
Yeah.
That's a good film. Gravity would be my choice for the best 3D movie experience of the 2010s. I find that 3D adds very little to most films. Like, I used to go and periodically see, especially the Pixar films in 3D, and I honestly cannot tell you which Pixar films I saw in 3D and which I did not. It doesn't add anything substantively, but this film is meant to be seen on a big screen in 3D. It does it right, and it's a great film. It was on my list. It was number 5 on my list for 2013. 2014, number 3, Birdman, or The Unexpected Virtue of Ignorance.
And I still have not caught up on that one. I need to see it.
Such
it's on
a
my
unique
list. I'll probably
film.
be watching it this year, but yeah.
It's also done in a mock single take, which they can do with digital effects now. It's about a man played by
Michael Keaton.
Michael Keaton basically playing a version of himself. This version played Birdman in a series, like Michael Keaton played Batman, in a series of action films. And he's trying to kind of rebrand his career by doing a serious piece of theater on Broadway, and he's just encountering all sorts of troubles doing it. It has Norton. What's his? Edward Norton's in it, playing a method kind of really into himself actor that he needs to work with. And then it's got Emma Stone as his semi-estranged daughter. It goes in some really unique directions. It's very creative visually, and pretty funny. Number 2, The Imitation Game.
This was a very good film.
True story of, was Alan Turning?
I forget his name.
His first name. He would come up with some of the ideas that would be the basis of future computer and telecommunication processes. He was a code breaker for the British in World War II. He was also a closeted homosexual at a period in which that could be punishable by time in prison. And he cracked a Nazi code.
The Enigma.
The Enigma code arguably changed the course of the war, arguably saved a great deal of lives. But ultimately, a few years after the war, he would be arrested and, I believe, imprisoned, right, for homosexual behavior?
I don't believe he's imprisoned, but he was chemically castrated.
Oh my goodness. And he is on currency there now. The pound, they don't just put politicians under the Queen. They put different figures, and recently they voted to put Alan Turing, at least for a time, on.
Yeah, tremendous story, great film.
And Keira Knightley's very good in it as the woman who would have been his love interest were he.
No, that's
straight.
True. They were married.
They were married.
Yeah.
And she very much, they loved each other.
Yes.
It's just he was not physically attracted to her. My number 1 film, if I were to go back and redo this list, I'm sure this would not be my number 1 film. But it was because I went to see it theatrically expecting it to be one thing. It was something else entirely, and it just blew me away. And that was Into the Woods.
I'm blown away that ever made your number 1 on one of
I
your lists.
loved it. So we took my mom and I think my sister. We took my sister-in-law and their kids. We wanted to go and see a movie, and we're like, oh, this is a fairy tale musical thing. It's got Anna Kendrick in it and James Corden. The kids will like it. We'll go see it. And I knew of it. I knew of the musical. I knew that it was kind of a revisionist take on fairy tales, but I didn't realize there was a second half. Because it goes more or less the way you're anticipating it's going to go, and then it stops, and then it shows what happens after the happily ever after and how much more complicated and messy it is.
Yep.
And I did not expect that at all. And it's like, how's this movie over? This movie's only halfway over. It's like, oh, there's another half. So, oh my goodness, look at this. They're dealing with divorce and betrayals, and it was just much deeper than I anticipated it was going to be. I thought it would be all fluff.
Yeah.
And it blew me away. I have not seen it since. I again, if I were to redo this list, I'm all but positive. Well, I'm sure it wouldn't have been number one. It probably would have been low on the list if it was on the list at all. But as a theatrical experience at that time, it really worked for me.
Yeah. Honorable mentions from that year: American Sniper and Selma.
Selma was good. American Sniper is another film that I took my sister to see, and she was crying at the end of it.
Yeah.
I have some issues with the actual guy that this is based on.
That's valid, but he also was. I mean, there are things umbrance you could take with him, and choices he made in his life, but he's a person whom you have to respect.
Yeah,
what he did.
Certainly incredible at what he did.
Yeah.
Moving on to 2015. Number 3, look up The Measure of a Man. Oh, yes.
Vincent Linden.
Oh, I looked at this and I'm like, I completely forgot this, but now I'm reminded this film is from Sweden or Norway or France?
France.
Yeah. It's about a guy who loses his job, and he's like some kind of industrial worker, and he has a prolonged period of unemployment, and eventually he gets a job, I want to say at like security at like a Walmart or Tesco type store, and the shot to his identity, like he obviously he had the income, but he knew who he was, and he made things, and now he's just trying to keep his family together, and it's sad and it's moving. And I saw it at the BYU International Film Society, going into it knowing almost nothing about it. Absolutely blew me away. I highly recommend it. Number 2 for that year, my number 1 and number 2 for this year, very close competition. Number 2 was The Big Short.
Okay.
Adam McKay film about the financial collapse in 2008 and events leading up to it, and how some people gamed the system to be able to turn the loss for many people into a big gain for themselves, which, I mean, you got to feel conflicted about this, but they couldn't have stopped it.
Yeah.
And they found a way. I mean, they weren't, I don't think they were really screwing people over.
No, they played the system in a way that benefited them and exposed a lot of the flaws in the system. At the time, there was a lot that was built on a house of cards, and it was obvious to anyone who actually understood the system. Yeah.
This has talking to the camera. This has Anthony Bourdain and Margot Robbie and Selena Gomez are brought in as themselves to explain things directly to the camera. This inaugurated a new type of filmmaking, which is true stories with a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek aspect to the presentation. Bombshell and Vice are also films that fall into this type. Really great film.
I'm sure this would have made my top 10 list for that year. Don't know if it would have fallen in the top 3 for me, though. Mm-hmm.
And my number 1 for that year, I think, is your number 1 as well. It's Spotlight.
Yes.
The true story of the Boston Globe investigation into the hiding of pedophile priests by the Catholic Church in the greater Boston area. Great ensemble cast. Again, you have Michael Keaton. You have the Hulk, Mark Ruffalo.
Yeah.
You have
Rachel McAdams.
Jamie Sheridan is in this very briefly.
John Slattery. Liev Schreiber.
Liev Schreiber is very good. Great film. It's another film that it's not that long ago, but it's also so long ago.
Yeah.
Those pre 9/11. In fact, they're doing this investigation, and they basically have to stop doing it for a month or two because 9/11 happens, which pushes back the release of their expose into early 2002. This is a group of reporters that the Boston Globe hires to just do really intensive, in-depth spotlight investigative reporting on something. They can spend a year working on something, sometimes more, before anything sees print, which is a big investment of time and money.
Yeah.
And something that really only newspapers could do. And now, since the business model of newspapers has been upended by changes in technology, there's not a lot of people able to devote this kind of resource to this kind of story, which is sad.
Although podcasting as a medium, I think, is going to start to
an extent,
take up some of that role.
Yeah.
Like you said, to a certain extent. A couple titles that didn't make your top 3 that I think are worth mentioning. Room. I think Room probably.
Still need to see Room.
I think for me that's easily in the top 3 of the year. I think Spotlight was the best movie of the year. Another one worth mentioning, The Martian.
The Martian was that year?
Yep.
2015?
Yeah, it was a nominee for Best Picture.
So I was, that was 2015? 2016. Number 3, Sing Street. And it's this, Sing Street, my number 3 favorite film or best film of 2016. It is by John Carney, who's an Irish director. He also did a film called Once, which is wonderful, a film called Begin Again. He does this musical films that have a lot of music in them but aren't really traditional musicals, but they're about music. Once, for example, is about a group of people recording an album, as is, I think, Begin Again.
Begin Again is kind of a redemption story of an artist, but yeah.
Yeah. This film is about an Irish teen in circa 1985 whose parents are in the process of getting separated and getting divorced. And he decides that he's got a girl that he likes. He wants to impress the girl. And he also likes music. His brother, this is a great film about relationships between brothers, because him and the guy that plays his brother, I mean, it's just the love that those two have for each other is just very moving. And the brother is trying to help him kind of land this girl through music. And so he starts a band as an excuse to recruit the girl to be in the band and in the music video. And it's just absolutely beautiful movie, which at some point you have got to see.
Yeah.
Very moving. Number 2 for 2016 was Moonlight. This was the film that... Oh, wait. This is the best film, not La La Land.
Yep.
This is a film about... It's the same character played by 3 different actors, 3 different time periods. It's about a man who has all these disadvantages in life. He is poor, black, and gay. And it's something I've not seen in film before, this kind of story, how tough this must be for this kid. And he goes from being picked on, and eventually he does become a drug dealer. He becomes kind of a rough customer, but a lot of that is due to the circumstances in which he finds his life. His mother was not a good mother, at least at first, though she eventually has something of a redemption arc. He is brought in. Mahershala Ali won his first Best Supporting Actor Oscar for this. He's not in the film very long, but he plays a drug dealer that sees something in this kid and tries to protect him and help him out, and eventually he is murdered. And it's just a beautiful, sad film, and it's not something I'd seen before, a story like this. I think it probably did deserve its Oscar, though my favorite film of the year was Manchester by the Sea, which is a beautiful film starring Casey Affleck and Michelle Williams, about a man in Boston who is called back home to a little town on the Massachusetts coastline called Manchester after his brother dies. And it's sad, and I've had some experience with familial death before, and it's sad, and a lot of this resonated, and it goes on, and then eventually you find out, wait, there's something much sadder that's happened before. And why is he reacting in a certain way to these things? And it is just beautiful and sad. Very moving film.
Yeah. Some other honorable mentions from that year. One that Nate and I have never agreed on, Arrival. I liked that one.
I liked Arrival fine, but like Joker, it's a film that kept making me think of an earlier film. In this case, Contact, which I feel this film borrows heavily from.
Yeah, but Fences is another good one from that year.
Fences was really good.
Yeah, I think those are the only ones worth mentioning.
2017, we had some recording difficulties we'll probably have to do a little editing on. So, again, I come up with an original list of my favorites of the year, and then I refine it as time goes on. Usually the second year, I'm able to look back on the previous year and come up with a final list. So 2017 was a strong year for film. Number 3 is The Florida Project, which you did eventually see.
Yeah, that's a good film.
This is a movie, it reminded me a bit of some of the people that we met on the mission that are just kind of living on the margins. This is about a woman who lives in one of those tacky tourist hotels in the Orlando area, kind of a lower level version of those. She literally lives there. It's her home. And she lives there with her daughters, probably about 5 or 6 years old. She's kind of a low-level criminal, kind of some low-level scams, and eventually she gets into some more serious stuff, which causes custody issues with her daughter. You know, the daughter has no idea how bad their lives are. She thinks it's great.
Yeah.
She lives around Disney World and around these tourist attractions, and she has minimal supervision, and she runs around and she has fun, and she thinks she has a wonderful life, but it's really sad. And Willem Dafoe got Oscar nominated for Best Supporting Actor, and I feel should have won, playing the man who runs this hotel, who's kind of a surrogate father figure and sees what's going on with this kid and feels bad about it and wants to help, but is limited in what he can do. And he also has his own issues going on. He's got kind of an estranged situation with his son, and it's just a beautiful and sad film. Number 2 for that year is Wind River. Wind River is a film by Taylor Sheridan. It is about a murder that happens on an Indian reservation, I think in Wyoming, during the wintertime. Jeremy Renner plays a man who works for Fish and Wildlife, and his job is to go out and get rid of excess wolf population, things like that. And he had been married to an Indian woman, which is why he lived in that general area, but that marriage dissolved in the aftermath of the death of their daughter. So while he's out hunting wolves in the snow, he finds the body of a good friend of his late daughter's, and of course reports it. And it's an Indian reservation, so it's under federal jurisdiction. So the FBI sends someone, but it's an Indian girl on an Indian reservation that died, and so they don't consider it a big priority. So they send a rather inexperienced agent played by Elizabeth Olsen out to investigate, and then because Jeremy Renner knows the area, he's brought in to assist. So this film is kind of, in a weird way, it's Hawkeye and the Scarlet Witch solving a mystery, even though it's totally not. It's got a really interesting late in the film kind of twist that happens to it. Very good, very powerful. Absolutely love this movie. Though my favorite film of 2017 is one in which we disagree quite strongly. It is a film that when I was watching it, it has this twist. Surprising me goes an awful long way to me in a movie, and this movie really surprised me, and it is The Phantom Thread.
Yeah, which I just didn't particularly care for. The ending, sure, it had a surprise. I think in this instance, liking the surprise does you perhaps a little bit of a disservice. I just couldn't get past the ending of this film and just kind of how twisted it was. It wasn't a terrible film. It certainly wouldn't make my best.
It's very slow and moody and kind of stilted, and a lot of the performers are they're underplaying. Because that's who these characters are. They're very sealed off. So
the majority of the film is very good. It's the ending that ruins it.
Daniel Day-Lewis, this is set in France in the early 50s. Daniel Day-Lewis is a very eccentric...
Yes.
All right, so set in London in the early 50s, and Daniel Day-Lewis is a very high-strung fashion designer, and he lives and works with his sister, who is played by Leslie Manville, and he meets this woman played by Vicky Krieps, who is, I want to say, from Luxembourg. He meets her. It's like a waitress at a diner that he goes to when he's on a vacation, and they become a romantic item. And he's just kind of toxic. And so there's times in which he's wonderful to her and times in which he's just awful to her. And they have this love-hate relationship that eventually she starts to reciprocate. And it's just bizarre. It's so messed up. It's so messed up. But it freaking works for him. And there's this moment at the end where you're like, are you seriously saying you want to spend the rest of your life like this? This is insane. And it's like, yes. Yep. Yes, this is what I like. This is what I want. And you're like, oh my goodness. Films that surprise me go a long way to me. And this film surprised me, even though it's one of two films to come out that year to have that same twist.
What's the other one?
The other one is The Beguiled.
Oh, I didn't see that one either. This was a very strong year for films. Some movies we should mention in that year: Three Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri.
Which you liked more than I did.
Yeah, The Shape of Water.
Which you liked more than I did.
I thought you liked it more than I did. I didn't care for it.
I didn't particularly. I thought it
didn't
was
care for it.
good. I'm glad that Sam Rockwell won an Oscar, but I kind of think it should have been for Richard Jewell rather than this part.
Oh, I just was talking about The Shape of Water.
Oh, The Shape of Water. That was
Yeah.
still talking about Three Billboards. Three Billboards you liked more than I did.
Yeah.
Shape of Water. What a bizarre film to win Best Picture.
Yeah.
It's really kind of the first science fiction film to win Best Picture.
Yeah.
First monster film.
The Post was also this year, which
Post
was
was
a very
really
good
strong.
film.
Yeah.
Lady Bird was a very good film. Get Out you liked more than I did.
I liked Get Out a lot more than you did.
Dunkirk,
Another film that surprised me.
Dunkirk was another good film from this year. Darkest Hour and Call Me by Your Name.
Yeah.
Now, I think we might agree on my next comment. What was the best? Do you recall what the best? What won best documentary that year?
You'll have to refresh me.
Icarus.
Icarus, which we watched. Yes.
Which is a very good documentary, and if you haven't seen it, you probably ought to go see it. It was on Netflix, I believe it still is.
So this brings us up to 2018. My third favorite film of 2018 was The Ballad of Buster Scruggs.
Good film.
Netflix-produced film, Coen Brothers film. It was the movie I didn't know I wanted or needed. It's an anthology western by the Coen Brothers. 6 different stories. They vary quite a bit in tone and in type. Quite a few good actors in it. It was just a joy. I absolutely adored this movie. Number 2 was number 1 on my list for a very long period, but something came in at the last minute and eclipsed it. First Reformed,
Oh, yeah.
which we talked about at some length when we talked about The Joker, where The Joker appropriated earlier films in a way that just drew my attention to the superiority of the earlier films. First Reformed incorporates earlier films in a nice synthesis that I think complements those. It is about a preacher, a reverend. They never say specifically his denomination, but he is the preacher at a Reformed church in upstate New York. It's a historic church. It's on the verge at the beginning of this film of celebrating its 250th anniversary. It's got a very small congregation. It's a satellite church of a larger megachurch in town, but it also makes income as a tourist attraction because it is such a historic pre-Revolutionary War church. In fact, it was a scene, they talk about some bullet holes from the Revolutionary War in the building. Ethan Hawke plays the Reverend. His marriage dissolved after the death of their son in the Iraq War. He's a sad, melancholy soul. And he is brought in by one of his few parishioners, played by Amanda Seyfried, to help her husband, who's become very depressive. He's an environmental activist who's basically lost hope. He thinks that the world is more or less doomed. And in the course of the film, he commits suicide. And Ethan Hawke attempts to help the widow, and he attempts to kind of piece together what had happened, and he becomes unhealthily obsessed about this. And he's also dealing with stresses relating to the 250th anniversary of the church. There's a man that is a local industrialist who is very heavily underwriting these expenses, but he is a man who's not a great person and whose company has done a lot of environmental damage. And the films that this movie borrows from is a French film from the early 50s called Diary of a Country Priest and a Bergman film from the early 60s called Winter Light. In fact, the first half or so of this film is pretty much Winter Light with some, padded, adjusted for present-day America. And in Winter Light, the crisis of the parishioner has to do with the worries about nuclear war, and here it has to do with worries about environmental degradation and apocalypse. That and Taxi Driver, you kind of stitch those two together. They're not a natural fit, but here it really works.
Yeah,
it's a film. We saw that together. I knew almost nothing about it. I hadn't even seen a trailer for this film at the
Neither
point
had
that I saw it theatrically, and blew me away.
Yeah, I really liked this film. Very strong film.
And my favorite film for the year 2018, another Netflix film, is Roma, which I saw on the big screen at the Tower Theater downtown. I wouldn't want to have seen this film, at least for the first time, on a small screen. This film is composed for a big screen. It's a beautiful... I'm not good with aspect ratios, but it's very clearly composed for a big screen. It's in beautiful black and white. It is based loosely on its director's childhood in Mexico City in the 1970s. There's a lot of kind of political things in the background that aren't necessarily spelled out for you that you can find out about researching it. There's a scene in this film where they're in downtown Mexico City and they have recreated blocks of downtown Mexico City, and they have got trolleys, and they've got the fronts of stores, and they've got people going in and out of them, and they've got merchandise, and they've got a theater. And it's just beautiful. It's just an absolutely beautiful film, and it's about a family that's going through a lot of changes. The father is a doctor. He's leaving the family to pursue a romantic interest elsewhere, leaving the mother, who is some kind of a teacher, professor, I think, to take care of the family. They have a live-in maid named Roma, and it's basically from her point of view. Absolutely beautiful movie.
Yeah. Some others that are probably worth mentioning from that year: Mary Poppins Returns, A Star is Born, Vice, Bohemian Rhapsody, and one that is worth mentioning but neither one of us really loved, Green Book. Yeah.
Other notable ones from that year would be The Favorite, Black Klansman, Crazy Rich Asians, which I liked a lot more than I thought I would, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, the Mr. Rogers documentary, Won't You Be My Neighbor, and Clint Eastwood's The Mule.
Yeah. Yeah, that was another decent year for film. Very good year. Oh. So,
well, we've rambled on pretty long about our favorite films of this year and of the recently past decade. There have been some years in this decade that have been better than others, but there's quite a lot of highlights, quite a lot worth seeing.
Very good films produced in the last decade.
Well, I'm Nate.
And I'm Rob.
And this has been Rob and Nate Record a Podcast.